The tragic story behind Britain's lost palace. Nonsuch Palace. The morning mist rises from the Surrey countryside, revealing nothing but gentle rolling fields where once stood the most extraordinary palace in English history. Here, in this unremarkable patch of earth near Cheam, Henry VIII spent the equivalent of $2 million in today's money every single day for 10 years, creating a palace so magnificent that visitors called it Nonsuch because there was none such like it anywhere in the world. Today, not a single stone remains above ground. The palace that was meant to outlast the pyramids, to humble the French king Francis I, and to cement Tudor supremacy for 1,000 years, survived barely 150 years before being demolished and sold off, brick by brick, to pay gambling debts. How does the most expensive secular building project in Tudor England simply vanish? And what does its complete erasure tell us about the dangers of unchecked power, ruinous ambition, and the forgotten thousands whose blood and sweat built a monument to one man's ego? Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Ground. April 20th, 1538. The small village of Cuddington in Surrey awakens to the sound of 500 men marching down its single main street. They carry sledgehammers, pickaxes, and crowbars. By sunset, the entire village, church, manor house, every cottage and barn, will be rubble. The residents, given just days' notice, stand watching as their ancestral homes are systematically destroyed. The church where generations were baptized, married, and buried is pulled down stone by stone. Even the graveyard is excavated, the bones of the dead carelessly tossed aside. This wasn't war. This was King Henry VIII clearing the ground for his new palace. The numbers alone stagger the imagination. Nonsuch Palace would cover 14 acres, contain over 400 rooms, and feature 2 towering octagonal towers that rose 5 stories high. The outer courtyard alone measured 230 feet by 175 feet, large enough to hold a modern football pitch. But mere size wasn't enough for Henry. This palace would be decorated with hundreds of plaster panels depicting Roman emperors, Greek gods, and scenes from classical mythology. The south facade would feature a massive relief of Henry himself, depicted as a Roman emperor receiving tribute from kneeling subjects. Over 700 carved slate panels would adorn the walls, each one unique, each one carved by master craftsmen imported from across Europe. The construction site became England's largest employer overnight. At its peak, over 500 craftsmen worked simultaneously: masons, carpenters, plasterers, painters, gilders. Another 1,000 laborers hauled materials, mixed mortar, and dug foundations. French and Italian artists arrived weekly at Portsmouth, clutching contracts promising wages 10 times what English craftsmen earned. Flemish glaziers created windows featuring revolutionary new techniques. Dutch engineers designed heating systems that would channel warm air through hollow walls. The palace represented not just royal excess, but a technological marvel that pushed medieval construction to its absolute limits. Yet for all its magnificence, Nonsuch was built on a foundation of pure spite. Henry VIII had attended the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, where Francis I of France had humiliated him with displays of wealth and culture that made the English court look provincial. 18 years later, still smarting from that embarrassment and fresh from dissolving the monasteries, which conveniently filled his treasury with stolen church wealth, Henry decided to build a palace that would eclipse anything in France. He chose the name deliberately: Nonsuch, or non-pareil, without equal. This wouldn't just be a home, it would be a weapon of architectural warfare. The king visited the construction site obsessively, sometimes staying in temporary lodgings just to watch the walls rise. Witnesses described him striding through the muddy grounds, his massive frame supported by a walking stick. His leg ulcers were already advanced, barking orders at architects, changing plans mid-construction, demanding that completed sections be torn down and rebuilt to new specifications. The original budget of $24,000 ballooned to over $360,000, roughly $200 million in today's money. Henry didn't care. He had dissolved 800 monasteries and seized their wealth. He had the entire treasury of English Catholicism to spend, and spend it he would. But even unlimited funds couldn't buy time. Henry was 52 when construction began, already obese, suffering from numerous ailments, and increasingly paranoid. He pushed the workers relentlessly, demanding night shifts, Sunday labor, sacrilege in Tudor England, and work through winter conditions that killed dozens of laborers from exposure. The palace rose with unprecedented speed, but also with corners cut, foundations rushed, and materials substituted when the finest couldn't be procured quickly enough. Modern archaeological surveys reveal foundation stones that were improperly laid, walls that began settling even during construction, and drainage systems that were never properly connected. As the towers rose and the elaborate stucco work took shape, something else was being built alongside the palace, a mythology. Nonsuch wasn't just architecture, it was propaganda carved in stone and plaster. Every surface told a story of Tudor supremacy, of Henry as the inheritor of ancient Rome, of England as the new empire. The irony, invisible to contemporary observers but glaring to modern eyes, was that this monument to permanence was being built with techniques and materials that guaranteed its eventual destruction. The elaborate stucco work that made Nonsuch unique was also its fatal weakness, vulnerable to English weather, requiring constant maintenance, beginning to deteriorate almost as soon as it was completed. Chapter 2. The Dissolution Fortune. To understand Nonsuch Palace, we must first understand the man who built it and, more importantly, how he paid for it. Henry VIII in 1538 was not the athletic prince who had ascended to the throne in 1509. At 52, he weighed over 400 pounds, his waist measured 54 inches, and suppurating ulcers on his legs emitted a stench that courtiers could smell 3 rooms away. Yet this decaying body housed a mind still sharp with ambition and cruelty, fresh from executing his second wife, and in the process of discarding his fourth. But most significantly, Henry had just completed the largest property grab in English history, the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry VIII systematically destroyed 1,000 years of English monasticism. 800 religious houses were dissolved, their residents expelled, their treasures confiscated. The numbers are staggering. 12,000 monks, nuns, and friars suddenly homeless. 35,000 people who depended on monastic employment thrown into destitution. Estates covering 1/6 of England's entire landmass, suddenly property of the crown. The portable wealth alone, gold chalices, silver crosses, jeweled reliquaries, filled 168 wagons that took 6 weeks to transport to London. Land sales and seized assets brought Henry approximately $1.3 million, the equivalent of $850 million today. This stolen fortune burned in Henry's pocket. French spies reported that Francis I was building a revolutionary new palace at Chambord, featuring a double helix staircase designed by Leonardo da Vinci himself. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was expanding his palace complex in Granada. Henry, who saw himself as their equal despite ruling a small, damp island on Europe's periphery, needed something spectacular. The monastery wealth gave him the means. His ego provided the motivation. The site selection for Nonsuch reveals Henry's ruthlessness. Cuddington Village wasn't chosen for its beauty or strategic importance. It was chosen because it was close enough to London for convenient visits, but far enough to require a proper royal progress. More importantly, the land belonged to Richard Codington, who held it directly from the crown and could be easily pressured to sell. When Codington hesitated, Henry simply invoked an ancient law that allowed the king to purchase any property within 12 miles of a royal palace for fair value, a value determined by Henry's own assessors. The demolition of Codington was more than practical necessity. It was a demonstration of absolute power. The village church dedicated to St. Mary contained monuments to the Codington family going back 3 centuries. Henry ordered them destroyed. When the vicar protested that canon law forbade the desecration of consecrated ground, Henry's commissioners reminded him that the king was now supreme head of the Church of England. The vicar fled that night, never to return. His replacement, installed by Henry, gave a sermon blessing the demolition as God's will expressed through his anointed sovereign. The financing structure of Nonsuch's construction reveals the economic revolution Henry had unleashed. Traditional royal building projects were funded through taxation, requiring parliamentary approval and causing public resentment. But monastery wealth required no such approval. It was technically already church property, and Henry, as supreme head of that church, could dispose of it however he wished. Payment records show extraordinary sums dispersed weekly: $500 to Italian stucco workers, $300 to Flemish glaziers, $200 to French woodcarvers. The chief architect, James Needham, earned $100 per year, 5 times what a prosperous merchant might make. Yet this lavish spending concealed a darker economy. While foreign artisans earned premium wages, English laborers received standard rates of 4 pence per day, barely enough to feed a family. These men, many of them displaced from dissolved monasteries where they'd worked as lay brothers or estate workers, faced a cruel irony. Building a pleasure palace with wealth stolen from institutions that had once fed and sheltered them. Construction site records, preserved in the National Archives, list numerous casualties. William Thorne, crushed by falling masonry. James Carpenter fell from scaffolding. Thomas Smith and his son Robert, dead of fever, contracted from sleeping in wet clothes after being denied time to dry them. The human cost extended beyond the construction site. The dissolution of Codington created England's first documented case of an entire community being forcibly relocated for a vanity project. The 200 residents were offered compensation, a pittance compared to their losses, and told to relocate to Ewell or Worcester Park. Many refused and became vagrants, joining the estimated 130,000 people made homeless by the dissolution. Tudor poor laws made vagrancy punishable by whipping for first offense, ear-cropping for second, and hanging for third. At least 12 former Codington residents appear in Surrey court records charged with vagrancy between 1538 and 1545. Chapter 3. The Impossible Construction. The morning of June 12, 1538, witnessed an extraordinary scene at Portsmouth docks. 43 ships had arrived from Antwerp, carrying something England had never seen before. 225 tons of carved slate panels, each one wrapped in oiled cloth and straw, each one numbered according to a master plan that existed only in the head of Nicholas Bellin of Modena, Henry's newly appointed chief designer. Bellin, standing on the dock in the rain, realized with growing horror that the panels had been loaded in the wrong order. What should have taken weeks to install would now take months to sort, catalog, and sequence. Henry's deadline remained unchanged. Nonsuch's construction challenged every aspect of Tudor building technology. The palace's revolutionary design abandoned traditional English architecture entirely, instead, embracing Renaissance principles that no English craftsman fully understood. The 2 great courts, outer court and inner court, were arranged along a central axis, a concept borrowed from Italian palace design but alien to English builders accustomed to organic, asymmetrical layouts. The octagonal towers that flanked the inner court's entrance required mathematical calculations for which English masons had no training. Henry imported Giovanni da Maiano from Florence specifically to oversee their construction, paying him the extraordinary sum of 20 shillings per day. The foundation work alone required innovation. The site's natural spring line ran directly through the planned palace footprint. Traditional solutions, diversion or drainage, would have taken years. Instead, Dutch engineers led by Peter van Wyck created England's first documented floating foundation, using layers of oak planks treated with tar and laid crosswise over compressed gravel. This technique, revolutionary for its time, would later prove the palace's undoing as the wood slowly rotted, causing differential settling that cracked walls and shattered the delicate stucco work. The logistical challenges stagger modern imagination. Every piece of Caen stone, prized for its fine grain and white color, traveled from Normandy quarries to the French coast, across the Channel to Portsmouth, up the Mole River to Ewell, then overland by ox cart to Nonsuch. A single day's delay in the Channel crossing could cascade into weeks of disruption. The carved slate panels from the Low Countries required specialized installation by Flemish craftsmen who spoke no English and refused to work alongside English masons they considered inferior. Work sites became segregated by nationality, with Italian stucco workers, French woodcarvers, Flemish glaziers, and English laborers operating in hostile isolation. The stucco work that gave Nonsuch its distinctive appearance pushed Renaissance craftsmanship to its limits. The mixture, lime, marble dust, and secret ingredients Bellin refused to share even with Henry, had to be applied at precise temperatures and humidity levels. Too hot, and it cracked. Too cold, and it wouldn't adhere. Too wet, and it sagged. English weather provided perhaps 15 days per year meeting these conditions. Bellin's solution was to erect temporary wooden shelters over work areas, heated by charcoal braziers that maintained Mediterranean conditions. The fuel costs alone exceeded the entire budget for Hampton Court's construction. Material acquisition became a diplomatic endeavor. Henry's agents scoured Europe for specific materials: pink marble from Verona, black marble from Dinant, alabaster from Nottingham, glass from Murano. When Francis Thorst learned Henry was trying to purchase carved panels from the workshop that supplied Fontainebleau, he immediately bought their entire output for 3 years. Henry retaliated by forbidding English wool exports to France, causing economic disruption across both kingdoms, all for architectural one-upmanship. The human machinery running this operation defied Tudor administrative capabilities. William Clement, Clerk of Works, supervised payment records for over 1,500 individuals. His surviving accounts, preserved at Kew, reveal a Byzantine system of contractors, subcontractors, and day laborers. Master craftsmen negotiated individual contracts. Their journeymen received weekly wages. Apprentices got room and board plus token payment. Common laborers queued each Saturday for their 4 pence per day. Foreign workers demanded payment in their own currencies, requiring money changers on site. Theft was rampant. Gold leaf disappeared nightly, tools vanished, even dressed stone blocks were stolen and sold to other building projects. Violence erupted regularly. On August 8, 1539, a brawl between Italian and English workers left 3 dead and 12 injured. The catalyst: an Italian plasterer had corrected an English mason's work, considered an unforgivable insult. Henry's response was typically brutal. The suspected ringleaders from both sides were hanged at the construction site, their bodies left displayed for a week as warning. Work never stopped during the executions. The construction's pace defied human endurance. Henry, aware of his declining health, demanded completion within his lifetime. Night shifts worked by torchlight, their productivity a fraction of day work, but psychologically important to the king, who would sometimes arrive unannounced at midnight to verify work continued. Winter construction, traditionally suspended from November to March, continued through freezing conditions. Mortar mixed with antifreeze compounds, salt and cattle blood, proved structurally weak, requiring later reinforcement. Frozen fingers couldn't perform detail work, so decorative elements planned for winter months were simplified or omitted entirely. By 1541, the palace stood substantially complete, though interior work would continue throughout the decade. The speed of construction, 4 years from foundation to roofing, was unprecedented for a structure of such complexity. But speed came at a price. Contemporary visitors marveled at Nonsuch's splendor, while privately noting strange cracks already appearing in the stucco, doors that wouldn't close properly, and an odd smell from the drainage systems that never quite worked as designed. Chapter 4. Palace of Paradoxes, January 15, 1545. The frozen Thames made travel from London impossible, but inside Nonsuch Palace, tropical birds sang in heated aviaries, while courtiers strolled through covered galleries where orange trees bloomed in December. Henry VIII, now so corpulent that he required a special crane to lift him onto his horse, presided over a banquet where sugar sculptures cost more than a laborer's yearly wage, decorated tables groaning under the weight of peacocks redressed in their feathers. Dolphins shipped alive from Portsmouth and cooked moments before serving, and wines from territories Henry would never rule, but whose vintages he could command. This was Nonsuch at its zenith, a fever dream of impossible luxury maintained by an army of invisible servants whose own children starved just beyond the palace walls. The operational requirements of Nonsuch challenged every assumption about domestic management. The palace required a permanent staff of 200 simply to maintain basic functions. The Great Kitchen, larger than most Tudor great halls, employed 30 cooks, 20 scullions, and 15 specialists, including a confectioner of subtleties, whose sole job was creating elaborate sugar sculptures. The kitchen consumed, on average days when the court wasn't even present, 40 sheep, 12 cattle, 200 chickens, 1,000 eggs, and 300 loaves of bread. During royal residence, these numbers tripled. The heating system alone required 40 men working in shifts. The Hypocaust-inspired design, with hollow walls containing a network of ceramic pipes, demanded constant feeding of specially selected hardwoods that burned at exact temperatures. Too hot, and the pipes cracked. Too cool, and condensation formed, rotting the elaborate wood paneling from behind. The fuel consumption was prodigious. Entire forests were designated solely for Nonsuch's heating needs. The keeper of the fires, one John Blackwood, earned more than a village priest, yet lived in constant terror of Henry's wrath should any room fall below the king's preferred temperature of 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Water supply presented unprecedented challenges. Traditional palace wells couldn't support Nonsuch's fountains, bathing rooms, and kitchen needs. Dutch engineers created England's first pressurized water system, using lead pipes and gravity-fed reservoirs to deliver running water to 3 floors. The system required constant maintenance as lead joints failed, pipes burst in winter, and the elaborate fountain mechanisms clogged with mineral deposits. The Master of the Waters employed 12 men full-time just to maintain water pressure. The social theater performed daily at Nonsuch followed scripts of Byzantine complexity. The Great Hall, designed to seat 300, operated according to strict hierarchical principles. Distance from the king's table determined social status to the inch. The salt cellar's position marked the divide between gentility and commonality. Below the salt sat minor gentry and wealthy merchants invited to witness royal magnificence. Above it sat nobles whose precedence was determined by genealogies stretching back to the conquest. These arrangements changed daily based on who was in favor, who had offended whom, and which foreign ambassadors required impressing or insulting through placement. The palace's artistic program demanded constant renewal. The external stucco work, despite its revolutionary composition, deteriorated rapidly in English weather. A team of 20 plasterers worked year-round on repairs, touching up, repainting, and often completely replacing panels. The gilt on exterior decorations required renewal every 2 years, at a cost exceeding most nobles' annual income. The interior paintings, many on cloth that stretched and sagged with humidity changes, needed constant attention from artists who mixed their pigments with exotic ingredients. Crushed lapis lazuli from Afghanistan for blues, cinnabar from Spain for reds, malachite from Germany for greens. The gardens represented a parallel universe of impossible maintenance. Henry demanded year-round blooms, forcing gardeners to create heated greenhouses, stove houses, where Mediterranean plants survived English winters. The privy garden's intricate knot patterns required daily trimming by mathematical precision. 17 different varieties of roses, each blooming at different times, were cultivated to ensure continuous flowering. The Bowling Green's grass, imported from France, needed cutting to exactly 3/4 of an inch, measured daily with specially crafted gauges. During summer months, 30 gardeners worked from dawn to dusk, maintaining just the formal gardens. Yet for all this grandeur, Nonsuch operated on fundamental contradictions. The palace that celebrated human achievement depended on dehumanizing labor conditions. Kitchen scullions worked 18-hour shifts during banquets, sleeping on the still warm hearths between duties. Laundresses processing the court's linens, 200 sheets changed daily, developed permanent curvatures of the spine from bending over wash tubs. The gong farmers, who emptied the palace's primitive toilets, worked only at night, forbidden from being seen by nobility, earning hazard pay that barely compensated for the diseases they inevitably contracted. The financial mathematics of Nonsuch defied logic. Annual operating costs exceeded $50,000, more than the Crown's entire income from Wales. A single royal progress to Nonsuch, lasting typically 3 weeks, cost $20,000 in preparations, provisions, and entertainment. The famous Masque of 1546, featuring mechanical dragons that breathed actual fire and an artificial mountain that split open to reveal nymphs singing Henry's praises, cost $8,000, enough to build 30 modest manor houses. Henry, by then barely able to walk, watched from a throne that required 8 men to carry, his ulcerated legs hidden beneath cloth of gold robes that cost more than the annual wages of everyone who served him that evening. Chapter 5. The Invisible Army. Before dawn, on March 3, 1544, Thomas Crofton rose from his straw pallet in the undercroft of Nonsuch Palace. As third underscullion, Thomas began his 19-hour workday by lighting fires in 8 kitchen hearths, each requiring specific temperatures for different cooking methods. By the time courtiers awakened at 9, Thomas had already scraped 200 iron pots, carried 40 buckets of water from the courtyard well, and plucked 60 chickens. His wage? 3 pence per day, plus scraps from the nobles' tables, if any remained after senior servants claimed their shares. Thomas was 14 years old. His story, preserved only because he died on duty and required a coroner's inquest, represents thousands whose labor made Nonsuch's magnificence possible. The palace's servant hierarchy formed a complex ecosystem of exploitation and marginal privilege. At its apex stood the great officers, the steward, treasurer, and comptroller, who earned $100 annually and dined with minor nobility. Below them, the gentlemen ushers, gentlemen pensioners, and sewers, servants of gentle birth who attended the king directly, formed a privileged class earning $40 yearly plus valuable perquisites, cast-off clothing, leftover wine, opportunities for bribes. The yeomen of the guard, yeomen of the chamber, and yeomen of the kitchen earned $20 annually, enough to maintain modest respectability. Then came the vast underclass: grooms, pages, scullions, laundresses, and laborers, earning pennies per day, sleeping wherever space permitted, eating whatever remained. The kitchen staff's experiences reveal Nonsuch's brutal realities. The master cook, Pierre Fontaine, Henry preferred French cuisine, commanded military discipline over his domain. Tardiness meant docked pay, theft of food brought whipping. Striking a superior meant dismissal without reference, effectively a death sentence in Tudor England's reference-dependent employment system. The heat was murderous. Archaeological excavations have revealed kitchen workers' skeletons showing signs of chronic dehydration and heat stress. Burns were constant. The palace employed 2 barber surgeons primarily to treat kitchen injuries. Yet positions were desperately sought after. Even the lowest scullion ate better than independent laborers, and proximity to power, however distant, offered possibilities for advancement. Women's labor at Nonsuch remains largely undocumented, their work so essential it was invisible. The laundry employed 40 women washing, starching, and pressing the court's linens. They worked in steam-filled rooms, their hands perpetually raw from lye soap, their backs permanently bent. Mary Carpenter, one of the few whose name survives, petitioned for compensation after losing her sight from constant exposure to soap fumes. Her petition was denied. She was replaced within a day. The dairymaids, brewery workers, and seamstresses, probably 100 women total, appear in records only as numbers, their individual stories erased. The stable staff maintained 200 horses in conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. Grooms slept with their charges, literally bedding down in straw beside valuable destriers worth more than a groom would earn in a lifetime. When Henry's favorite horse, Burgundy, developed colic, the 3 grooms responsible for his care were flogged despite veterinary testimony that the condition was unavoidable. The keeper of the hounds maintained packs totaling 300 dogs, each pack requiring specialized care, feeding, and training. The dogs ate better than their keepers. They received fresh meat daily, while servants made do with salt pork and dried peas. The gardening staff battled impossibility daily. Henry's demand for Italian-style gardens in English weather required agricultural fraud on an industrial scale. Potted lemon trees were wheeled out for royal walks, then rushed back to heated houses. Dead plants were replaced nightly with fresh ones propagated in hidden nurseries. The head gardener, Jacques Mollet, employed 30 men full-time plus day laborers hired from surrounding villages during planting and harvest. These temporary workers, paid 2 pence per day without food, often walked 10 miles each way for work, arriving before dawn and departing after dusk. Construction never truly ceased at Nonsuch, requiring a permanent maintenance workforce. Master craftsmen, masons, carpenters, glaziers formed an aristocracy of labor, earning enough to maintain families in modest comfort. Below them, hundreds of assistants and laborers existed in perpetual economic anxiety. John Fletcher, a carpenter's assistant, left a rare written account in a letter to his brother. "The palace devours men as surely as any dragon. Young Robert fell from scaffolding Tuesday last. His back broke. William's hand was crushed beneath stone blocks. Thomas coughs blood from the lime dust. Yet 50 men wait to take our places should we falter." The supply chain supporting Nonsuch created entire economies of dependence. Carters transported goods from London daily, their wages dependent on weather, road conditions, and successful delivery. Suppliers of everything from candles to spices maintained agents near the palace, competing viciously for contracts. The economic ripple effects extended throughout Surrey. Farmers sold produce, brewers provided ale, woodcutters supplied fuel, all locked into relationships with a palace that paid slowly, partially, or sometimes not at all. Disease spread rapidly through servant quarters. The overcrowded undercrofts, poor ventilation, and inadequate sanitation created perfect conditions for epidemics. The sweating sickness of 1545 killed 30 servants in a week. Palace records show replacement servants were hired before the dead were buried. Injuries were endemic: crushed fingers, broken bones, hernias from lifting, burns from kitchens, frostbite from winter work. The palace's 2 surgeons treated nobility. Servants relied on folk remedies or suffered in silence. Yet amid this suffering, moments of humanity survived. Servants created their own hierarchies and support systems. They married, celebrated feast days, shared windfalls. The account books occasionally record small kindnesses: extra rations for a sick worker, permission for funeral attendance, a blind eye to minor pilferage. These glimpses suggest that even within Nonsuch's grinding machinery, human connections persisted, small acts of solidarity against the magnificent indifference of power. Chapter 6. The King is Dead. January 28, 1547, 2 o'clock in the morning. Henry VIII drew his last breath at Whitehall Palace, but at Nonsuch, 20 miles away, the great machine of royal service ground on in ignorance. Cooks prepared breakfast for a king who would never eat again. Gardeners trimmed hedges for eyes that would never see them. Grooms saddled horses for a rider who could barely walk, let alone mount. The news, when it arrived at dawn, transformed Nonsuch instantly from the supreme expression of royal power into an expensive problem nobody wanted to solve. Edward VI, 9 years old and tuberculosis already eating at his lungs, had no interest in his father's architectural folly. The boy king's protectors, first the Duke of Somerset and then the Duke of Northumberland, viewed Nonsuch as a financial hemorrhage. The palace consumed $50,000 annually to maintain, money desperately needed for their political struggles. Yet selling it was unthinkable. Nonsuch was too symbolically important, too tied to Tudor legitimacy. Instead, they attempted economy, dismissing 3/4 of the staff overnight. The results were predictable and catastrophic. Without adequate maintenance, Nonsuch began its slow dissolution. The elaborate stucco work, requiring constant attention, cracked and flaked. Winter frost invaded the cracks, expanding them into chasms. The innovative heating system, reduced to skeleton crews, failed systematically. Pipes burst, flooding the elaborate wooden paneling, which warped and rotted. The fountains, their mechanisms clogged and pumps unmaintained, became stagnant pools breeding mosquitoes. The tropical plants in their heated houses froze during the winter of 1548, when fuel allocations were cut by 2/3. The head gardener, Jacques Mollet, wept openly as he watched 20 years of cultivation die in a single night. The dismissed servants faced destitution. Tudor England had no social safety net beyond parish charity, itself overwhelmed by the dissolution's aftermath. John Blackwood, the former keeper of fires who had maintained Nonsuch's heating for 9 years, was found dead of starvation in Ewell 3 months after his dismissal. Mary Carpenter, the laundress already blind from her work, became a beggar on London Bridge. The French and Italian artisans, their contracts abruptly terminated, found themselves stranded in a hostile country. Some managed passage home. Others disappeared into London's immigrant underground. Several were arrested for vagrancy and died in prison. When Mary Tudor claimed the throne in 1553, she brought Catholic sensibilities that viewed Nonsuch as a monument to her father's heresy. The palace, built with stolen monastery wealth, represented everything she sought to reverse. Yet political reality forced her to maintain it. Foreign ambassadors expected to be entertained there. The court required a summer residence, and destroying Nonsuch would admit that Henry's reign could be erased. Mary compromised by minimal maintenance, visiting rarely, and allowing the palace to decay genteel rather than face demolition's admission of defeat. Philip of Spain, Mary's husband, visited Nonsuch once in 1554 and recorded his disgust. The palace that was meant to humble European monarchs had become an embarrassment. Spanish courtiers reported walls stained with water damage, ceilings collapsed in unused wings, and rats bold enough to appear during daylight. The great fountain in the inner court, its mechanism finally failed beyond repair, had been converted to a fish pond. The banqueting house's roof leaked so badly that dinners were served under canvas stretched beneath the ceiling. Philip never returned. Elizabeth I inherited Nonsuch in 1558 and initially invested in restoration. The young queen, always conscious of imagery, understood the palace's propaganda value. She spent $3,000 in her first year repairing the most visible damage, focusing on external appearances while ignoring structural problems. The stucco panels were repainted in brighter colors than Henry ever imagined. Blues and reds and golds that blazed in sunlight but looked garish to contemporary eyes. Elizabeth held court at Nonsuch during summers, but her festivities had a desperate quality, as if noise and celebration could mask the building's accelerating decay. The financial burden proved unsustainable, even for Elizabeth's parsimony. By 1570, she had spent $20,000 on repairs with no end in sight. The fundamental problem was Nonsuch's experimental construction, techniques that had barely worked when new now failed catastrophically. The floating foundation had rotted, causing differential settling that no amount of surface repair could address. The innovative materials, the special stucco, the experimental mortars, the hybrid structural systems, all deteriorated in ways nobody had anticipated. Elizabeth's surveyor reported that properly restoring Nonsuch would cost more than building a new palace entirely. Elizabeth's solution was creative, but ultimately destructive. In 1591, she gave Nonsuch to John, Lord Lumley, supposedly as reward for service, but actually to shift the financial burden. Lumley, wealthy but not infinitely so, managed basic maintenance while allowing non-essential areas to deteriorate. He closed entire wings, boarding windows and sealing doors. The second floor of the inner court, where Henry had maintained his private apartments, was abandoned entirely. Birds nested in rooms where kings had slept. The great octagonal towers, their upper floors now inaccessible due to collapsed staircases, became vertical ruins within an occupied palace. The human cost of this decline multiplied the original construction's suffering. Skeleton crews of servants maintained partial operations in dangerous conditions. Ceilings collapsed without warning. 2 servants died in 1595 when the Great Hall's plaster ceiling fell during dinner preparation. The compromised drainage systems bred disease. Outbreaks of flux and fever killed dozens. The few remaining gardeners fought a losing battle against nature, reclaiming Henry's formal designs. The knot gardens became impenetrable tangles. The bowling green reverted to meadow. The exotic fruit trees, unpruned and untended, died one by one until only twisted stumps remained. By 1600, Nonsuch had transformed from palace to burden, from achievement to embarrassment, from Henry's bid for immortality to a crumbling reminder of hubris. Yet its final destruction would wait another century, as if England couldn't quite bring itself to admit that the greatest palace ever built in Britain was, ultimately, a failure of imagination that mistook grandeur for permanence. Chapter 7. The Gambler's Ruin. April 1670. Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine and mistress to King Charles II, walked through Nonsuch Palace calculating its demolition value. Each panel of carved slate, $5. Each ton of lead from the roofs, $12. The marble columns, $200 per piece. The entire palace, Henry VIII's testament to eternal glory, had become an accounting exercise in architectural cannibalism. Within 6 months, Nonsuch would vanish from the earth as completely as the village it had replaced, destroyed not by war or disaster, but by the casual greed of a royal mistress settling her gambling debts. The path to this moment began with the Restoration. Charles II, returning from exile in 1660, inherited a monarchy impoverished by civil war and commonwealth. Royal palaces had been sold, stripped, or converted to barracks. Nonsuch, remarkably, survived relatively intact. Cromwell's Puritans had been too busy destroying churches to bother with secular architecture. Charles visited once, found it hopelessly old-fashioned compared to Versailles, and never returned. The palace that had cost millions to build now generated nothing but maintenance bills. Charles's solution reflected his character: generous, careless, and ultimately destructive. In 1670, he gave Nonsuch to Barbara Villiers as partial payment for services history prefers to euphemize. Barbara, beautiful, ruthless, and perpetually in debt from gambling losses exceeding $30,000, saw Nonsuch not as heritage, but as opportunity. Her surveyor, one Thomas Hanson, provided the fatal arithmetic. Maintaining Nonsuch cost $2,000 annually, but its materials, sold piecemeal, would yield $15,000. The decision took minutes. The demolition began secretly. Barbara knew that destroying Nonsuch would provoke outrage, so she started with the interior, stripping valuables that could be removed without obvious external change. The carved paneling went first, sold to London merchants who resold it to country gentlemen decorating their new manor houses. The marble fireplaces were extracted whole, leaving gaping wounds in walls. The lead, water pipes, installed at such expense, were pulled from the walls and melted down. Even the glass, expensive crown glass from Venice, was carefully removed and sold. George Villiers, a local farmer unrelated to Barbara, left the only eyewitness account of the systematic destruction. They worked like locusts, stripping everything of value. I saw them burning the great carved doors to extract the iron hinges more easily. Whole rooms of paneling were ripped out in hours. The famous painted ceiling of the presence chamber, which showed King Henry among the gods, was pulled down in pieces, the plaster crushed to powder and sold for fertilizer. Nothing was sacred, nothing preserved. The external demolition began in September 1670. The famous stucco panels, impossible to remove intact, were simply smashed from the walls. Fragments bearing faces of Roman emperors, Greek gods, and Tudor roses were shoveled into carts and sold as hardcore for road building. The M25 motorway, constructed centuries later, probably runs over crushed remnants of Nonsuch's revolutionary facades. The octagonal towers were undermined and pulled down using teams of oxen, their stones immediately dressed for reuse. Within weeks, the skyline that had dominated Surrey for 130 years vanished. The speed of destruction outpaced the original construction. What had taken 500 men 4 years to build was destroyed by 50 men in 4 months. The demolition crews, many of them descendants of the original builders, showed no sentiment. John Fletcher's grandson, also named John and also a carpenter, earned more money demolishing Nonsuch than his grandfather had earned building it. The economic logic was irrefutable. Destruction paid better than creation. Local residents looted whatever the official demolition missed. Accounts from the period describe scenes of carnage. villagers carrying away doors, windows, floorboards, even individual bricks. The parish church at Cheam suddenly acquired elaborate carved panels that parishioners claimed had been donated by a benefactor. Houses throughout Surrey sprouted suspicious architectural details, a Tudor rose here, a carved lion there. Nonsuch didn't just disappear, it dispersed, fragments spreading across southern England like architectural spores. The foundations proved most profitable. The innovative floating foundation contained thousands of oak beams, perfectly preserved by tar treatment and compression. These timbers, already 130 years old and iron-hard from aging, were worth fortunes to shipbuilders. The Royal Navy, expanding under Charles II, bought enormous quantities for warship construction. HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, probably contained timber that once supported Henry VIII's palace. In this way, Nonsuch's destruction funded the naval supremacy Henry had dreamed of but never achieved. Barbara Villiers realized approximately $14,000 from Nonsuch's demolition, clearing most of her gambling debts. She showed no recorded regret. The palace that had embodied Tudor ambition meant nothing to restoration sensibilities beyond its cash value. Charles II, informed of the demolition's completion, reportedly said, "My father lost his head for less than what my mistress has done, yet she keeps hers, and I keep her." The casual wit masked a cultural catastrophe. By Christmas 1670, Nonsuch had vanished so completely that visitors couldn't identify where it had stood. The great terraces were plowed under, the foundations excavated and backfilled, the gardens returned to farmland. Within a decade, people disputed the palace's exact location. Within a generation, it seemed mythical. John Aubrey, visiting in 1673, wrote, "One would think it impossible that so famous a structure should vanish without trace, yet I could find no stone upon stone, no sign that here once stood the wonder of England." The demolition's efficiency reflected changing values. The Renaissance reverence for classical achievement had yielded to restoration pragmatism. Beauty without function was waste. History without profit was sentiment. Nonsuch died not from neglect, but from a calculation that its parts were worth more than its whole, that money mattered more than memory. Chapter 8. Ghosts in the Ground, February 1959. Archaeologist John Dent carefully brushed soil from what appeared to be carved stone. After 3 weeks of excavation in Nonsuch Park, his team had found only broken bricks and pottery fragments. Now, 2 feet down, ornate carving emerged, a cherub's face perfectly preserved, staring up after 3 centuries underground. Within hours, they had uncovered dozens of pieces, fragments of the revolutionary stucco work that had made Nonsuch unique. The palace that vanished without trace was beginning to speak from beneath the Surrey earth. The excavation, led by Oxford archaeologist Martin Biddle, revealed that Barbara Villiers' demolition, thorough as it seemed, had missed enormous amounts. The foundations, cut off at ground level and covered, remained largely intact. The cellars, filled with demolition rubble, preserved thousands of fragments. Most remarkably, the elaborate drainage system survived complete, its lead pipes and ceramic channels mapping the palace's hydraulic circulation like fossilized veins. For the first time since 1670, Nonsuch's footprint became visible. What emerged challenged every assumption about the palace. The foundations revealed construction techniques more advanced than historical records suggested. The floating foundation included sophisticated drainage channels that directed groundwater away from vulnerable timbers. The cellar complex was vast, 3 times larger than documents indicated, suggesting extensive service areas never mentioned in contemporary accounts. Most surprisingly, The excavations revealed an entire undercroft level beneath the outer court, probably servant quarters, completely absent from all palace descriptions. The artifacts told stories of daily life that written records had ignored. Thousands of pottery fragments revealed eating habits across social hierarchies: fine majolica for nobles, standard English earthenware for middle servants, crude vessels for scullions. Bones in different areas showed dietary disparities: beef and venison near the royal apartments, mutton and pork in servant areas, bare subsistence fare of grain and occasional bacon in the lowest quarters. One touching discovery: a child's toy knight carved from bone, found in what was probably a scullion's sleeping area, reminding us that children lived and worked in Nonsuch's shadows. The excavations revealed the scale of human tragedy during construction. Several skeletons were found in construction fills, probably workers who died on site and were expeditiously buried in foundations rather than receiving proper burial. One skeleton showed evidence of a crushed skull. Accident or murder, impossible to determine. Another, a young person of indeterminate gender, had been placed carefully with hands crossed, suggesting co-workers had provided dignity despite circumstances. These bodies, never recorded in palace accounts, testified to Nonsuch's hidden casualties. Modern technology revealed even more. Ground-penetrating radar in the 1990s showed that Nonsuch's footprint extended far beyond the palace proper. Entire complexes of outbuildings, stables, workshops, storage facilities, surrounded the main structure. Magnetometry revealed the locations of ironworks, suggesting on-site production capabilities never mentioned in records. The palace wasn't just a building, but an industrial complex, a self-contained world whose full extent is only now being understood. The recovery of decorative fragments enabled digital reconstruction. The stucco panels, painstakingly reassembled from thousands of pieces, revealed iconographic programs of unprecedented complexity. The scenes weren't random classical decoration, but carefully orchestrated propaganda. One reconstructed panel showed Henry VIII as Hercules defeating the Hydra, the many-headed monster representing the Catholic Church. Another depicted Tudor roses growing from the corpse of a dragon, probably representing vanquished France. Every surface had carried political messages, now readable after centuries of silence. Chemical analysis of materials revealed international supply chains. The stucco contained volcanic ash from Italy, specifically from areas near Vesuvius. The red pigments included cinnabar from Spanish mines. Gold leaf showed trace elements indicating West African sources, gold that had traveled through Portuguese trading networks. Nonsuch was globalization made architectural, its very substance a map of Tudor England's economic reach. Environmental archaeology revealed the ecological impact. Pollen analysis showed that Nonsuch's construction had deforested approximately 2,000 acres. The palace's fuel demands had consumed entire woodlands. Seeds and plant remains indicated that the famous gardens had included species from 5 continents. Biological imperialism that introduced non-native plants still growing wild in Surrey. The palace had literally changed the landscape's botanical composition, its ecological effects persisting long after its physical destruction. The excavations also recovered human stories. A cache of personal items, coins, buttons, a broken knife, a piece of jewelry, was found hidden in a wall cavity, probably a servant's life savings concealed and never retrieved. Love tokens carved with initials suggested romances among palace staff. A concentration of medicine bottles near the servant quarters revealed efforts to self-medicate in the absence of medical care. These fragments humanized the palace's anonymous workforce. Local memory, dormant for centuries, reawakened with the excavations. Elderly residents recalled grandparents' stories about finding carved stones in fields. Family traditions of ancestors who worked at the old palace gained credibility. One family produced a carved panel, supposedly from Nonsuch, that had decorated their fireplace for generations. Authentication proved it genuine, a piece of the inner court's decoration that had survived as a farmhouse ornament. The archaeological work continues sporadically, limited by funding and the fact that Nonsuch Park remains public space. Each excavation reveals new details, but also new questions. Recent ground-penetrating radar suggests structures extending under modern roads and buildings, areas that will never be excavated. Nonsuch's full extent may never be known, its complete story never recovered. Yet, what has emerged from the earth is enough to reconstruct not just architecture, but lived experience. The broken pottery, lost coins, hidden treasures, and hastily buried bodies tell stories that magnificent stucco panels never could. They reveal Nonsuch as it truly was, not just Henry's monument to himself, but a complex community where hundreds lived, worked, loved, suffered, and died. The palace that vanished from the surface persists underground, its true foundation not oak and stone, but human memory preserved in Surrey soil. Chapter 9. The Palace That Never Was Today. Elderly dog walkers cross Nonsuch Park, unaware they tread on England's most expensive ghost. Children play football where Henry VIII once received ambassadors. Joggers follow paths that trace the outline of vanished galleries. The palace that was meant to proclaim Tudor supremacy forever has become absence made permanent, its only monument a small museum housing fragments and a scale model showing what was lost. Yet Nonsuch's disappearance speaks louder than its existence ever did. A sermon in stone and silence about the futility of architectural immortality. Nonsuch represents English history's most spectacular architectural failure, but failure that teaches. The palace cost approximately $200 million in modern currency to build and generated nothing but expense for 130 years. Its construction destroyed a community, consumed forests, and broke bodies. Its operation demanded impossible economics, maintaining Mediterranean luxury in English weather. Its demolition proved more profitable than its existence. Every aspect of Nonsuch's story inverts conventional heritage narratives, where preservation equals virtue and destruction equals loss. The palace's erasure reflects changing English relationships with power and display. Tudor excess, gold leaf, impossible gardens, armies of servants, gave way to Georgian restraint and Victorian morality. Nonsuch embarrassed later sensibilities. The Georgians built Palladian mansions celebrating proportion over decoration. The Victorians constructed Gothic revival palaces invoking imagined medieval virtues rather than Renaissance excess. Neither era could accommodate Nonsuch's pure ostentation. Its destruction became retroactive editing, removing an uncomfortable chapter from architectural history. Modern heritage professionals struggle with Nonsuch's legacy. How do you preserve absence? How do you interpret something that exists only in fragments? The site resists conventional heritage treatment. There's nothing to restore, little to display, no romantic ruin to stabilize. Nonsuch Park contains some foundation markings and interpretive panels, but these feel inadequate, like describing symphony through sheet music. Virtual reality reconstructions, however sophisticated, cannot convey the weight of stone, the smell of hundreds of fires, the sound of fountains that no longer flow. The economic lessons resonate particularly today. Nonsuch was Tudor England's grandest vanity project, consuming resources that could have built hospitals, schools, or infrastructure. The $50,000 annual operating cost could have funded England's entire university system. The construction workforce could have built hundreds of ordinary homes. Every aspect of Nonsuch represented misallocation of finite resources toward infinite ego. Modern parallels, oligarchs' compounds, corporate headquarters, Olympic facilities used once then abandoned, suggest humanity hasn't learned Nonsuch's lesson. The labor history embedded in Nonsuch's story challenges heritage narratives that celebrate architectural achievement while ignoring human cost. Every Tudor palace represents extraction of labor from workers, wealth from subjects, resources from landscape. Nonsuch's particular history, built with stolen monastery wealth by workers denied basic dignity, makes this extraction explicit. The palace cannot be celebrated without acknowledging its foundations in theft and exploitation. This complicates tourism, education, and commemoration. How do you market a monument to oppression? Archaeological evidence continues challenging romantic narratives. Each excavation reveals more evidence of suffering: skeletons in foundations, lead poisoning in bones, repetitive stress injuries in joints. The beautiful palace was a machine for consuming lives. The revolutionary architecture required revolutionary exploitation. The impossibility of maintaining Nonsuch, its fundamental unsustainability, was built into its conception. Henry demanded the impossible and achieved it temporarily through human sacrifice, but physics and economics always win. Nonsuch's dispersal creates unexpected continuities. Pieces of the palace survive throughout Surrey in houses, churches, and gardens. These fragments, decontextualized and democratized, may better honor the workers who created them than any intact palace could. A carved panel in a cottage, a statue in a parish church, a foundation stone in a garden wall. These remnants have become vernacular architecture, absorbed into ordinary lives. The palace that proclaimed hierarchy has been redistributed, its grandeur dissolved into community. Environmental historians find Nonsuch's ecological impact persisting. The deforestation patterns remain visible in aerial photography. Non-native plant species, introduced for the palace gardens, have naturalized throughout Surrey. The altered water table, from Nonsuch's elaborate drainage systems, still affects local hydrology. Even demolished, the palace continues shaping its landscape. This persistence through absence offers different immortality than Henry imagined. Not monument, but scar, not achievement, but warning. Educational programs struggle with Nonsuch's contradictions. School visits to the park must explain absence, teach about something that isn't there. This requires imaginative pedagogy, using archaeological fragments, digital reconstructions, and historical documents to conjure vanished magnificence. Yet the absence itself teaches powerfully. Children understand immediately that something enormous disappeared completely. This sparks questions about permanence, value, and memory that intact buildings rarely provoke. The site's current use as public park represents historical justice. Land stolen from common use for private magnificence has returned to community ownership. Where Henry VIII displayed absolute power, families picnic. Where courtiers performed elaborate rituals, dogs chase frisbees. This transformation from exclusion to inclusion, from hierarchy to democracy, from palace to park, suggests progress despite the centuries of suffering between. Modern Surrey barely remembers Nonsuch beyond place names: Nonsuch Park, Nonsuch High School, Nonsuch Business Park. The palace has become branding, its absence commercialized. This seems appropriate. Nonsuch always was more idea than reality, more ambition than achievement. Its modern afterlife as marketing continues its original function as propaganda, though now selling education and office space rather than Tudor supremacy. The palace that was meant to be without equal has achieved unique status through absence. No other major English palace has vanished so completely. This makes Nonsuch paradoxically more present in imagination than buildings that survive. The void demands filling with speculation, research, and story. Chapter 10. The Weight of Absence. Stand in Nonsuch Park on a misty morning, and you might glimpse what Henry saw in his fever dream of permanence. The land rises and falls in patterns that once supported terraces and fountains. The ancient oaks, survivors from the Tudor forest, remember when they were saplings watching stones rise and fall. But listen closer, and you hear the true legacy of Nonsuch. Silence where there should be history, absence where there should be monument, questions where there should be answers. We have traced Nonsuch from violent birth through impossible life to casual death. We have counted its cost in pounds and lives, measured its ambition in tons of marble and years of labor. We have recovered fragments from the earth and memories from archives. Yet the palace's greatest revelation is not what we've found, but what remains lost. The names of workers who died building Henry's dream, the stories of servants who sustained his fantasy, the accounts of those displaced and destroyed for royal ego. Nonsuch failed as architecture, but succeeds as warning. Every vanished stone testifies that no amount of wealth can purchase permanence, no degree of power can command immortality, no magnificence can justify suffering. The palace that was meant to proclaim Tudor glory forever, instead, demonstrates glory's transience. The monument to unprecedented achievement became proof that all achievement crumbles. The nonpareil palace is now the paramount absence. This investigation has revealed not one story but thousands. Each worker, each stone, each demolished life a thread in the tapestry of power and its consequences. If these stories disturb our comfortable heritage narratives, good. If they complicate our architectural romanticism, better. If they challenge us to see magnificence and suffering as inseparable, best. For you walking through Nonsuch Park, knowing now what lies beneath your feet, the absence becomes presence. Each step crosses vanished foundations. Each breath draws air that once carried the sounds of construction and destruction, celebration and suffering. You stand where Henry VIII proclaimed his immortality and where Barbara Villiers counted her gambling winnings. You occupy the space between memory and forgetting, between history and silence. The palace is gone, but the questions remain. What monuments are we building on others' suffering? What future archaeologists will excavate our vanities? What absences will tell our story? Nonsuch was. Nonsuch is not. Nonsuch teaches. Remember that. Question everything. The ground beneath us all is full of ghosts.